It has long since been acknowledged that the people written about in the Book of Mormon are not all of the people in the Americas prior to European contact. It has long been recognized, furthermore, that the people that the Book of Mormon deals with would have had to occupy a rather small, relatively very small portion of the entirety of the Americas, thus the endless debates about where this was. And so along with that, it's also acknowledged that there were other people in the Americas when Lehi landed and when Jared landed. And so the question is, did they interact? It seems to me that many people don't really pause to break this down and to consider it carefully. And when they cite the consensus, do I say it? It's a consensus. When they cite the concession, the understanding of there being other people in the Americas when these groups landed and when these civilizations had their rise and fall, they take that as necessitating an immediate conclusion that, of course, they must have interacted. They must have interacted with natives, and the surrounding native cultures must have had an influence on the Zarahemla civilization. But the record never calls this out specifically, and they say, well, because they just didn't care. They were just focused on their own sphere of influence. And to me, that never satisfies. To me, that sounds like hand-waving. At the very least, I am hungry for a picky, meticulous, pedantic, insufferably microscopic breakdown of this question. So I'm going to attempt to get started on that while I'm driving in my car without notes, just because that's how I roll. So there are natives in the Americas when Jared lands with his party and when Lehi lands with his party. So there's various scenarios that are possible and varying degrees of the interaction that these scenarios propose. One scenario is that some of these groups, we could split them into, for now, let's split them into Jaredites, Nephites, Lamanites, and Mulochites. You know, because I didn't mention them because presumably they come after after Lehi's party. Though, I mean, if Lehi's party dawdled for 8 years, I mean, Muloch's party would have had come south through Arabia as well, or launched in the Red Sea or something, but they would have presumably taken the same route. I guess some people say that, depending on your geographical model, if you think that Lehi and his group went around the Cape of Africa and came across the Atlantic, which has problems, but then people would have thought that, yeah, Muloch and his party would have crossed the Atlantic, you know, leaving maybe on a Phoenician ship, crossing the Mediterranean, and so on. And I'm not going to get into that here. What I'm interested in is the question, the possible scenarios of these various groups interacting with natives, and when and to what degree. Did they eye each other warily across a river? Did they send merchants back and forth and welcome visitors and just sort of decide to coexist and then somehow absorb cultural influence? Did they intermarry? So one scenario that people often propose that has baffled me, honestly, is that let's just focus on Lehi's party now. They land and they immediately find natives, and they immediately find themselves, integrated or somehow just drawn in. They immediately find themselves part of this cultural world. People point to Nephi's words where he talks about the split, and he takes people with him to leave where they are, leave their place of first inheritance, first landing. And all who would go with me, they point to that and say, well, we can read that and it implies there were more than just his family. The problem I see with that is Nephi has not made any mention of this uncomfortable event that as soon as they land in their promised land, it's full of Gentiles. You're telling me that a group of Israelites who have left the besieged city of Jerusalem to get away from Gentiles, to get away from those horrible Babylonians, and find a place where they can finally be free to be their broken off branch of Israel and live their faith and their covenant with their God without being threatened by a superior pagan Gentile civilization, that when they get to their promised land, they find that it is already under the control of a numerically superior, advanced pagan Gentile civilization. They're not going to have something to say about it. That Nephi is not going to have anything at all to write about it. Is he in denial? Does he choose? I mean, granted, these events happen years, decades before he ever puts his burin on the small plates. Maybe by the time the 30 years after Jerusalem have come around and it's time for him to write, he's thinking, you know what? I'm just going to pretend like all these filthy Gentiles that forced, that took over and forced us to leave because they took over and corrupted my brothers and assimilated them. I'm just going to pretend that they don't exist. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to pretend they don't exist. I'm not going to mention them at all. I find that very hard to believe. I find it hard to believe if you ask me to put that kind of... think of Nephi with that kind of... skepticism? Cynicism? I don't know. I talked about this before when I mentioned how I accept Nephi's righteousness in killing Laban, and I reject readings that want to cast him as this kind of scheming liar when he writes his record that doesn't compute, it doesn't make sense in my mind with everything else. It casts doubt on the whole enterprise, which I think is mighty convenient for some kinds of projects that some people want to hijack the Book of Mormon into. And I reject those projects, and I talked about that. And so to ask me to believe that he deliberately chose to just ignore and pretend like an established pagan Gentile civilization that they ran right into when they landed, that he's just going to pretend that doesn't exist, and that, to me, that's a bridge too far. That's too much. Sorry. If you want to, come up with some reasoned explanations as to why that might make sense for Nephi, because he wasn't a Deuteronomist, this will be fun. But somehow I think that the people that are most in advocacy of this are probably the least likely to be hip to this idea of Nephi as an anti-Deuteronomist. And that's another can of worms that I don't want to keep opening here. So, another scenario is... I guess the virtue, the advantage of this scenario, let's just go with it for a moment, is, Lehi and his group, they land and they find this established pagan Gentile civilization already controlling their promised land, and they have to come to some terms with it and with them, with the people they find. And I suppose in this scenario, what happens is Nephi succeeds in converting some of them and doesn't mention that either. I mean, if it's a success, so if it's not just like a failure, if it's not like an embarrassing, failure of the prophecy of, to really come about like they hoped, but instead it's like a success. Oh, we came here and it was full of pagan Gentiles. Oh no. But we managed to convert some of them. Some of them joined our people. We joined them and we, like Zoram, we persuaded them to come along with us and they have joined us. You'd think that he would mention that. But let's say he didn't. And let's say somehow he managed to convert, a group of these people, but most of them went along, Laman and Lemuel and Ishmael's sons assimilated into the native civilization and ganged up on Nephi and said, let's kill this guy and his followers. And Nephi and everybody, they pick up and leave and they go somewhere else, right? They go somewhere where it's safe. Now, the new place where they go where it's safe, do they find somewhere uninhabited? They strike out and start to settle virgin territory on their own, go out into the jungle where there isn't a city-state? Or do they run into another established city-state, another group of people, and somehow manage to win them over without any mention of it? Second scenario. Okay, so sorry. The advantage to this scenario, however, is that if you have an immediate mixing of the Israelite immigrant colonizers, if you have an immediate mixing of them with the natives on both sides, Nephites and Lamanites, then you can avoid the uncomfortable question of having to face up to the skin of blackness question. You can say, well, it can't possibly refer to a literal change in melanin content of the epidermis because both groups intermarried with the browner skinned natives, and so it has to be something else. So we don't have to face the specter of racism at all, and that comforts us, and comfort is good, and therefore it must be right, and we're going to go with that and plant our flag there and defend it. Not so fast, for the reasons that I've just said. An alternate theory that I heard proposed about 20 years ago, and I do not know how common this is, but that proposed, I think, that the Lamanites were the ones who intermarried with natives, and that the Nephites didn't mention that because of their racial prejudices. I'm all right with the possibility of some of these ancient people having a kind of racial prejudice. In fact, Jacob's sermon to the Nephites, right soon after the death of Nephi, pretty strongly implies that they had some kind of bigotry. Whether you want to call it a racial prejudice or whether you want to call it a bigotry based on their disgust at seeing people in war paint and tattoos, somehow they had a prejudice against the Lamanites based on the darkness of their skins, whatever that meant, that Jacob was calling out and calling them to repent from. Human beings are naturally bigoted against people who are not like them. You can do that along all kinds of lines. It doesn't have to be racial, but human beings, the natural man, will do this. The natural man will naturally draw lines between us and them. And that's not a cultural thing unique or peculiar to Mesoamerica or North America or the Middle East or anywhere. It's in the heart of every single Homo sapiens. So the scenario is that the Lamanites, after the split, or even before the split, that the Lamanites are the ones that intermarry with natives, and Nephi, seeing this, says, oh, gee, what happened? They're darker. They must have been cursed, because he sees well, okay, does he see children of his relatives who have married natives? Or does he see the natives who his relatives have mixed with and they now are called their people? Still seems a bit odd for him not to mention something like, oh no, there were Gentiles in the land, and my brothers fell in with them, and they have become Gentiles. This is terrible. Because he would recognize who his relatives were. Again, when he writes his account, it's 30 years after leaving Jerusalem. So it's maybe 20, 22 years in the promised land. All right, let's think about biology here. How long does it take a human to reach sexual maturity? Let's say 12 years. Let's say that the first generation of children born to the travelers in Lehi's party are born about a year after they leave Jerusalem. And so they're about between 7, 8 years old, depending how long it took to build the ship and to cross and all this. So when they get to the promised land, let's just say in 4 more years they reach sexual maturity. All right? That's what... my math is getting wonky. I've laid this out on a spreadsheet. The long and short of it is, I have to go. I have to get to work. The long and short of it is, it's kind of difficult to make the case that Nephi, 30 years after leaving Jerusalem, would have seen a lot of children of his relatives and natives with darker skin, and called that, been alluding to that when he talks about this skin of blackness. Maybe he would have seen some striplings. Maybe some of them would have, if we have a scenario where people begin mating and reproducing as soon as they reach sexual maturity, then we get possibly some young, older than just toddlers. We might actually, I think we might actually get some striplings that Nephi could observe and recognize as descendants, as children of his relatives, children of his brothers, and call that change in their coloring a curse of a skin of blackness. I don't believe this. I think it's a bit. I think it's tenuous. You have to make these stretches. So yay, we've avoided, maybe, we don't have to. We're still okay as far as the racism thing goes. We still have the possible racist scenario of mixing with natives, being called a skin of blackness, because maybe Nephi doesn't ever see actual natives. He just goes to a peace conference to try to negotiate terms, and oh my goodness, Laman has his grandson there, because Laman and Lemuel, if we are to believe Jacob, Laman and Lemuel, the sons of Ishmael, are not likely to take additional wives from the natives and produce mixed children that way. So it has to be the second generation mating, coupling, reproducing, marrying, mixing the races and producing those children. So Laman's grandsons are, maybe Laman doesn't bring his wife. So maybe Laman's son doesn't bring his wife, but he brings his sons. And Nephi sees, oh my goodness, what happened? They must have been cursed. Oh, it's a bit of a stretch. So because it's a bit of a stretch, maybe we can kind of just sort of put it aside and say that's asking too much. I don't think we are going to take that very seriously, because it asks for us to stretch a bit. And so we don't like it, and we think it's kind of racist, and so we're going to just put it aside. Now, if you think that's a stretch, the first scenario of both groups immediately mixing with a larger culture of pagan Gentiles is an even bigger stretch considering the evidence of the text. And I just ask in an open plea to all those involved in researching this, I ask you to acknowledge this and to do more rigorous analysis of this than I have seen so far. And that's all the time I have to talk about it now, but I have this on my mind and I've been writing about it, and so I'm probably going to talk about it again soon. Thank you for listening, and the Book of Mormon is true, and I will talk to you later. Bye.